It was a quiet afternoon outside the local high school, a place where laughter and voices of hope usually filled the air. But on this particular day, the atmosphere was charged with something darker. She sat there, a 14-year-old girl in her wheelchair, holding her backpack tightly as she waited for her father to pick her up. The sun cast long shadows across the pavement, but the shadow that approached her was colder, heavier, a police officer. His boots clicked against the ground, his posture oozing authority. She glanced up, offering a polite nod, but his gaze was already filled with disdain. "What are you doing here?" he barked, his tone sharp, almost cutting. She hesitated, confused by his hostility. "I'm waiting for my dad to pick me up, sir." "Don't serve me," he snapped, his voice rising. "I've seen your type hanging around here. You people always find a way to stir up trouble. What are you really doing here?" Her throat tightened, her palms sweaty as she clutched the armrests of her wheelchair. I'm just waiting," she stammered, her voice trembling under his glare. He scoffed, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer. "You think you can pull the sympathy card because of that chair? You think that makes you untouchable?" Her heart pounded. She could feel the stares of a few onlookers, their curiosity mixed with discomfort. She wanted to explain herself, to plead, but she didn't owe him an explanation for simply existing. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered, barely audible. But he wasn't listening. His hand shot out, gripping the arm of her wheelchair, jerking it slightly. "Don't get smart with me," he spat. "Kids like you, your kind, always think you're above the law. I'll show you otherwise." The girl's voice broke as she tried to protest, panic rising like a tidal wave. "Please, you're hurting me." But the officer didn't let up. He yanked harder, tilting the chair just enough to make her feel unstable. Her breath caught in her throat as she struggled to stay balanced. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She didn't want to give him that satisfaction. And then, from behind them, came a voice. Calm, steady, and yet carrying the weight of a storm about to break. "Let her go." The officer froze, turning slowly. Standing there was a man in a dark suit, his eyes locked on the scene before him. His presence was commanding, his jaw set tight as he took a step closer. The girl recognized him immediately, relief flooding her chest even as the tension in the air thickened. "And who do you think you are?" the officer sneered, but there was a flicker of unease in his tone. The man didn't answer right away. He glanced at the girl, his gaze softening for a moment before he turned back to the officer. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice like a blade, sharp and unyielding. "A mistake you won't be able to walk away from." The officer's bravado faltered, but he quickly masked it with arrogance. "Oh, is that so? What are you gonna do, sue me? Go ahead. See how far you get." But the man's next words cut through the air like a thunderclap. "I'm not here to sue you. I'm here to hold you accountable." The officer's smirk wavered, confusion mixing with defiance. "What the hell are you talking about?" The man stepped closer, his presence looming. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his tone chilling. "But when you do, remember this moment. Remember the girl you tried to intimidate. Because she's stronger than you'll ever be. And she has people who will fight for her." The officer's grip on the wheelchair slackened, his confidence beginning to crumble under the weight of the man's unwavering stare. But the tension didn't leave the air, it only shifted, coiling tighter as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The girl's father hadn't raised his voice, hadn't lashed out, but there was a storm brewing in his silence. And the officer, despite his bravado, could feel it. He didn't know who this man was, but something in his gut told him that he had just crossed a line he would regret. The girl looked up at her father, her tears finally spilling over. But they weren't tears of fear anymore, they were tears of something else. Something she couldn't quite name, but it felt like safety, like justice, like hope. What the officer didn't know what he couldn't have possibly imagined, was that this man wasn't just a protective father. He was an FBI agent, a man who had spent years uncovering corruption, dismantling power structures, and bringing men like him to their knees. And now, the officer was about to find himself at the center of a reckoning he would never forget. The officer might have thought he was untouchable, that his badge was a shield. But he was about to learn that some shields are paper-thin when faced with the weight of truth and justice. And as the man turned to his daughter, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, the question hanging in the air wasn't if the officer would face the consequences, it was how far those consequences would reach and how much he would lose in the process. What happens when the very system you think protects you turns against you? How far can one man go to ensure justice for his child? And just how much does it cost to pay for years of unchecked power and prejudice? Stay with us as we uncover the answers, one twist at a time. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To our black viewers and everyone who supports the fight for equality, we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. Our stories aim to shed light on injustice and inspire meaningful conversations about change and hope. If you enjoy thought-provoking narratives with powerful twists, please subscribe to our channel and join us in creating a world where every voice matters. Thank you for being here, and now, enjoy the story. The school parking lot buzzed with the usual energy of dismissal, cars pulling in and out as students exchanged goodbyes and hurried off to start their afternoons. The late autumn sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden hues over the scene. Among the crowd was Tiana Brooks, a 14-year-old girl with a quiet determination and a love for science that often earned her the nickname, Professor, from her friends. Tiana sat in her wheelchair at the edge of the pickup area, her posture straight and proud, despite the challenges she faced daily. Life as a black teenager in a predominantly white school wasn't easy, and being a wheelchair user made her feel even more conspicuous. Yet, Tiana carried herself with resilience, her sharp mind and warm personality leaving a lasting impression on those willing to look beyond the surface. Her father, Malcolm Brooks, was running late. He was rarely late. Malcolm was a seasoned FBI agent, a man who moved through life with a commanding presence and an air of quiet authority. Though his work often kept him away from home, his love for his daughter was unmistakable. Every evening, they would sit together at the kitchen table, sharing stories about their day, Tiana's eyes lighting up as Malcolm told her about his work solving high-stakes cases. He was her hero, not just because of his job but because of the way he always made her feel like the most important person in the world. Tiana glanced at her watch, her father's delay causing a twinge of annoyance. She had told him about a science project she was eager to start, one that involved building a model of a Mars rover, and he had promised to help. Still, she understood that his job often came with unpredictable demands. She shifted in her chair, adjusting her backpack on her lap as students dwindled around her. The crisp air carried the faint sound of distant traffic, and for a moment, everything felt ordinary. That sense of normalcy shattered when a shadow loomed over her. Officer Ethan Grayson, a patrol cop notorious for his abrasive demeanor, stood there, his gaze sweeping over her with thinly veiled disdain. Ethan was a man who thrived on control, his badge a shield that often allowed him to push boundaries unchecked. In his late 30s, he was a product of a system that had long enabled men like him, arrogant, dismissive, and quick to judge. He wasn't patrolling the school out of duty but rather because it gave him an opportunity to exert authority where he felt it wasn't questioned. His arrival at the school was usually accompanied by tension, a fact not lost on the students who avoided him whenever possible. "What are you doing here?" Ethan's voice cut through the calm, sharp and laced with suspicion. Tiana blinked, startled by his sudden presence. She tried to keep her voice steady as she replied, explaining she was waiting for her father. But Ethan's demeanor didn't soften. Instead, he leaned closer, his tone growing colder, more accusatory, as if her existence in that space was inherently wrong. The tension was palpable. Tiana could feel her pulse quicken, her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair as Ethan's questions became more pointed, his words dripping with a mix of condescension and hostility. He questioned why she was there, implying that she didn't belong, his words a thinly veiled attack not just on her presence but on her identity. Each sentence felt like a blow, the humiliation settling deep in her chest. She tried to defend herself, her voice trembling but firm, insisting she had done nothing wrong. Ethan's smirk in response only deepened her sense of powerlessness. Nearby, a small crowd had begun to gather, their curiosity tempered by discomfort. No one intervened, their silence a reflection of the fear Ethan inspired. He leaned down, gripping the handle of her wheelchair, tilting it slightly. The motion was subtle but intentional, enough to unsettle her and remind her of his control in that moment. Tiana's breath hitched, tears threatening to spill as she struggled to maintain her composure. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to feel. And then, from a distance, Malcolm arrived. His car pulled into the lot, his sharp eyes immediately assessing the scene. He didn't rush at first, instead taking a moment to observe, his mind piecing together what was happening. When he finally stepped out of the car, his presence was commanding, his tall frame and calm demeanor drawing the attention of those around him. Tiana's relief was immediate, her father's arrival a lifeline in a sea of chaos. Malcolm's voice was measured as he addressed Ethan, his words carrying an authority that couldn't be ignored. But underneath that calm was a storm brewing, his protective instincts roaring to life as he pieced together the humiliation his daughter had just endured. Ethan, however, was slow to recognize the man standing before him. He dismissed Malcolm's calm warnings, his arrogance blinding him to the danger he had just stepped into. Tiana watched as her father stepped closer, his tone shifting, growing colder as he made it clear that Ethan's actions would not go unanswered. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Ethan's face, but he quickly masked it with bravado, dismissing Malcolm's words as empty threats. He didn't realize who he was dealing with. He didn't realize the weight of the connections Malcolm held, the resources he could mobilize with a single call. As the confrontation unfolded, Tiana's emotions swirled, relief, anger, and a deep sense of gratitude for her father's unwavering support. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing, her father wouldn't let this slide. And neither would she. This wasn't just about her, it was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, who had been humiliated for simply existing. It was about justice. The crowd began to disperse as Malcolm led Tiana to the car, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Ethan stood there, his confidence shaken but not yet broken. He still believed his badge would protect him, that he would walk away from this unscathed. But Malcolm knew better. He had seen men like Ethan before, men who thought power was their birthright, who wielded it without accountability. And Malcolm was determined to ensure that this time, justice would prevail. As they drove away, Tiana glanced at her father, her voice quiet but firm as she said, "He won't get away with this, will he?" Malcolm's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his jaw set as he replied, "Not if I have anything to say about it." The determination in his voice was unshakable, a promise that Ethan Grayson's arrogance would soon meet its match. What Ethan didn't realize was that he hadn't just crossed a line, he had set off a chain of events that would unravel everything he thought he knew about power and consequence. And as Malcolm began to make the calls that would set his plan into motion, the question lingered, how far would a father go to protect his child? The car ride home was unusually quiet. Tiana sat in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the passing streets, though she wasn't really seeing them. Her hands gripped the straps of her backpack tightly, her knuckles white as she replayed the encounter in her mind. She had never felt so small, so powerless. The officer's words echoed in her ears, his sneering tone, his hand gripping her wheelchair. Her body tensed at the memory, but when she glanced at her father, the storm brewing in his expression told her that he was feeling every bit of her anger, and then some. Malcolm didn't say much at first, his focus sharp as he maneuvered the car through traffic. His jaw was clenched, and the veins in his temple throbbed with restrained fury. He had spent years training himself to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly even in the face of chaos. But today, that discipline was hanging by a thread. What he had witnessed was more than a simple abuse of power. It was an attack on his daughter, on her dignity, and on everything he believed in. The badge that officer wore represented a system Malcolm had dedicated his life to upholding, but it had been used as a weapon to humiliate someone he loved more than anything in the world. Tiana finally broke the silence, her voice low but trembling with emotion. Why do people like him get to wear a badge? Why do they get to treat people like that and just walk away? Malcolm exhaled sharply, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. He wanted to answer her, to tell her that justice would prevail, but he knew how hollow those words could sound. Instead, he said, because too many people let them get away with it. But not this time. Tiana turned to him, her brow furrowed. What do you mean? He glanced at her briefly, his eyes full of determination. I mean, he picked the wrong person to mess with. You don't deserve what happened to you, and he's going to learn that there are consequences. When they got home, the air inside the house felt heavier than usual. Malcolm dropped his keys on the counter and immediately reached for his phone. Tiana watched him as he made call after call, his tone professional but laced with an undercurrent of anger. Names she didn't recognize were mentioned, people within the bureau, attorneys, even local officials. Each conversation seemed to add another layer to whatever plan he was forming. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, the way he was piecing together a strategy. Later that evening, Malcolm sat down at the kitchen table, his laptop open and a notepad beside him. Tiana hesitated in the doorway, unsure if she should interrupt, but he looked up and motioned for her to join him. She wheeled herself over, the hum of the wheels breaking the silence. I need you to tell me everything, Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. Every word he said, every move he made. Don't leave anything out. Tiana took a deep breath, her hands fidgeting in her lap as she began to recount the incident. Her voice wavered at times, but Malcolm didn't interrupt. He listened intently, his pen moving across the notepad as he took detailed notes. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. This isn't just about what he did to you, Malcolm finally said. It's about what he's probably done to others. Men like him don't just wake up one day and decide to abuse their power. It's a pattern. And we're going to find it. Tiana's eyes widened. You think he's done this before? Malcolm nodded. I'm sure of it. And if we can prove it, he won't just lose his badge. He'll lose everything. Over the next few days, Malcolm's plan began to take shape. He reached out to colleagues he trusted, people who understood the importance of accountability. He combed through records, searching for complaints filed against Officer Ethan Grayson. What he found was both infuriating and unsurprising, a pattern of misconduct complaints, most of which had been dismissed or quietly settled. There were allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and even false arrests. Each case painted a clearer picture of a man who had been shielded by a system designed to protect its own. Malcolm's frustration grew as he realized how deeply rooted the problem was. It wasn't just about one bad cop, it was about a culture that allowed men like Ethan to operate without fear of consequences. But Malcolm wasn't deterred. If anything, it made him more determined. One evening, as Malcolm sat at his desk reviewing case files, Tiana approached him with her phone in hand. Dad, she said hesitantly, I think I might have something that can help. She handed him her phone, and his eyes widened as he watched the video she had secretly recorded during the confrontation. The footage wasn't long, but it was damning. Ethan's voice was clear, his words dripping with hostility, his actions impossible to justify. This is it, Malcolm said, his voice filled with a mix of pride and resolve. This is the proof we need. The next step was reaching out to the community. Malcolm knew that change couldn't happen in isolation. He connected with local activists, people who had been fighting for police accountability long before this incident. Together, they began to build a case, gathering testimonies from others who had experienced similar treatment at Ethan's hands. Slowly but surely, a pattern of abuse began to emerge. Meanwhile, Ethan was oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He carried on as if nothing had happened, confident that his badge would protect him as it always had. But cracks were starting to form in his facade. Rumors began to circulate within the department, whispers of an investigation that reached higher than anyone expected. Ethan dismissed them at first, but the unease in his gut grew with each passing day. As the tension built, Malcolm prepared for the moment when everything would come to a head. He knew that taking down someone like Ethan wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he couldn't stop now. Too much was at stake, not just for Tiana, but for every person who had been silenced, every victim who had been denied justice. One evening, as Malcolm sat with Tiana in the living room, she looked at him and asked, "Do you think it'll work? Do you think we can actually stop him?" Malcolm placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. "It's not about if it'll work. It's about making sure he can't hurt anyone else. And we're going to make sure of that." The weight of those words hung in the air, a promise that Malcolm intended to keep. But neither of them could predict just how far the fight for justice would take them, or how much they would uncover along the way. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, one thing became clear: Ethan Grayson's time was running out. And when the reckoning came, it would be more than he ever expected. The hearing room was unassuming, its beige walls and rows of chairs meant to inspire neutrality, but the tension within was anything but calm. Tiana sat near the front, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her wheelchair pulled up close to the table where her father sat beside her. Malcolm wore a dark suit, his FBI badge tucked discreetly in his pocket. His expression was calm, but his eyes betrayed the fire burning beneath the surface. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, piecing together every detail, every scrap of evidence, ensuring that when the time came, the truth would be undeniable. Across the room, Ethan Grayson sat, his posture stiff, his jaw clenched as if he could will away the growing weight of the accusations against him. His attorney, a sharp-looking man with graying hair, whispered something in his ear, but Ethan didn't respond. He was too busy staring at Malcolm, his glare filled with resentment. To Ethan, this wasn't about justice, it was a personal vendetta, a challenge to the authority he had wielded unchecked for years. The proceedings began with procedural formalities, a slow, deliberate process that seemed designed to stretch the nerves of everyone in the room. Malcolm's jaw tightened as he listened to Ethan's attorney attempt to downplay the accusations, spinning a narrative of misunderstanding and overreaction. It was a performance designed to sow doubt, but Malcolm knew it wouldn't hold for long. He had come prepared, and he was ready to dismantle the lies piece by piece. When it was his turn to speak, Malcolm stood, his voice steady and measured as he addressed the room. He began by recounting the incident at the school, painting a vivid picture of Ethan's actions and their impact on Tiana. His words were deliberate, each one chosen to cut through the noise and land with precision. Tiana listened intently, her father's voice grounding her as he spoke. He didn't just describe what had happened, he laid bare the humanity of the moment, the fear, the humiliation, the way Ethan's actions had stripped away her sense of safety. Her chest tightened as Malcolm's words brought the memory rushing back, but she reminded herself that this was necessary. They were here to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had. When Malcolm finished, he presented the video Tiana had recorded. The room fell silent as the footage played, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan's voice filled the room, his words dripping with hostility and disdain. The arrogance in his tone was unmistakable, his abuse of power laid bare for everyone to see. Malcolm watched the faces around the room, noting the subtle shifts, the furrowed brows, the stiffened shoulders, the quiet anger simmering beneath the surface. As the video ended, Ethan's attorney stood, his tone defensive as he attempted to discredit the footage. He argued that it lacked context, that it was a snapshot of a larger interaction that had been blown out of proportion. Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line as he listened, his patience wearing thin. He knew what was coming next, and he was ready. When the time came for cross-examination, Malcolm leaned forward, his voice firm but calm as he addressed Ethan directly. He began by asking about the complaints filed against him, each question methodically chipping away at the facade Ethan had tried to maintain. Ethan's answers were evasive at first, but Malcolm pressed on, his tone unrelenting as he brought up specific incidents, each one tied to a name, a face, a story of abuse. Tiana watched as her father unraveled Ethan's defenses, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always known her father was good at his job, but seeing him in action was something else entirely. He was relentless, his words sharp and precise, each one a nail in the coffin of Ethan's credibility. And then came the moment Malcolm had been building toward. He presented a file, thick with documents, each one meticulously compiled over the past few weeks. He laid it on the table, his voice steady as he explained its contents: records of misconduct, testimonies from victims, evidence of a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. Ethan's attorney attempted to object, but Malcolm cut him off, his voice rising just enough to command the room's attention. He turned to Ethan, his gaze piercing as he asked, "How many times have you used your badge to silence someone who couldn't fight back? How many people have you humiliated, knowing they didn't have the power to stop you?" Ethan's face reddened, his composure cracking as he struggled to maintain control. His voice was defensive, his words coming out in short, clipped sentences as he attempted to justify his actions. But the weight of the evidence was too much, the truth too glaring to ignore. Malcolm didn't let up. He leaned in, his tone sharp as he delivered the final blow. "You thought you could do this forever, didn't you? That no one would ever hold you accountable. But today, you're going to learn that there are consequences." The room fell silent, the weight of Malcolm's words hanging heavy in the air. Tiana's heart raced as she watched Ethan shift uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence crumbling before her eyes. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that justice was within reach. As the hearing continued, the tension in the room grew, each revelation adding another layer to the case against Ethan. Tiana glanced at her father, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. He had fought for her, for the truth, and for every person who had ever been silenced. And as the proceedings drew to a close, one thing became clear: Ethan Grayson's days of unchecked power were over. But the full extent of his reckoning was still to come. The air in the room was thick with tension as the hearing resumed. Malcolm remained steady, his demeanor calm and calculated, but his mind was racing. He had laid out the evidence, had exposed Ethan Grayson for the bully and abuser he was, but he knew the hardest part was yet to come. The next phase would decide everything, not just for Tiana, but for every victim who had suffered in silence under Ethan's reign. This wasn't just about accountability, it was about setting a precedent, about showing that no badge could shield someone from the consequences of their actions forever. Tiana sat beside her father, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She tried to steady her breathing, but every glance at Ethan made her pulse quicken. He sat across from them, his face a mask of defiance, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. The walls he had built around himself were beginning to crumble, and the cracks were showing. His attorney leaned in close, whispering urgently, but Ethan didn't respond. He was too focused on Malcolm, too consumed by the slow realization that he was losing control. The judge addressed the room, her voice firm as she announced the next phase, the testimonies. Malcolm had been waiting for this moment. He rose from his seat, his movements deliberate as he approached the stand. He had called several witnesses, each one a piece of the puzzle that painted a damning picture of Ethan's conduct. The first was a young man, barely out of his teens, whose voice trembled as he recounted the day Ethan had wrongfully detained him for looking suspicious. His words were halting at first, but as he spoke, the pain and anger in his voice became impossible to ignore. "I told him I hadn't done anything wrong," the young man said, his hands gripping the edge of the stand, but he wouldn't listen. "He shoved me against the car, called me names, made me feel like I was nothing. And when I tried to explain, he told me to shut up, that my kind didn't get to talk back." Malcolm watched Ethan's reaction carefully. The officer's jaw tightened, his fists clenching under the table. But he didn't speak. He couldn't. The young man's testimony was followed by another, and then another, each one a thread in the tapestry of abuse that Ethan had woven over the years. There was a woman who described being pulled over without cause, her voice shaking as she recounted the humiliation of being searched in front of her children. There was an older man who spoke of a similar experience, his tone measured but filled with quiet rage as he described the way Ethan had treated him like a criminal for walking through his own neighborhood. Each story added weight to the case, and with every word, Ethan seemed to shrink further into his seat. His attorney's objections grew weaker, his arguments less convincing. The room was shifting, the power dynamic tilting away from Ethan and toward the truth. Tiana felt a swell of hope as she listened to the testimonies. These were people who had been silenced for so long, finally given a platform to speak their truth. And they were using it. When it was Tiana's turn to speak, the room fell silent. All eyes were on her as she wheeled herself to the stand, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the sides of her chair as she steadied herself. Malcolm gave her an encouraging nod from his seat, his expression a mix of pride and determination. Tiana's voice was soft at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke. She described the day of the incident, the way Ethan had approached her, the words he had used, the way he had made her feel powerless. She spoke of the fear, the humiliation, the anger that had stayed with her ever since. Her voice cracked at times, but she didn't stop. She looked directly at Ethan as she spoke, her gaze unwavering. "You looked at me like I wasn't even a person," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Like I didn't deserve to be there, like I didn't belong. But I do belong. And you don't get to take that away from me." The room was silent when she finished, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Even the judge seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Malcolm's chest swelled with pride as he watched his daughter. She had faced her fear, had stood up to the man who had tried to diminish her, and she had done it with strength and grace. Ethan's attorney scrambled to regain control, attempting to discredit the testimonies, to paint Ethan as a dedicated officer who had simply been misunderstood. But the evidence was overwhelming, the voices of the victims too powerful to ignore. Malcolm knew that the tide had turned, that Ethan's arrogance was no longer enough to shield him from the truth. As the final arguments were made, Malcolm leaned toward Tiana, his voice low but firm. "No matter what happens today, you were brave. You stood up for yourself, and for everyone he's ever hurt. That's what matters." Tiana nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. She believed him, but she also knew that she wanted more. She wanted justice. She wanted accountability. And as the judge prepared to deliver her decision, the tension in the room reached its peak. Malcolm glanced at Ethan one last time, taking in the man who had caused so much pain. This was it, the moment where everything would change, where the truth would finally prevail. The judge's voice rang out, firm and decisive, and with every word, the weight of the past weeks began to lift. The decision was clear: Ethan Grayson would face consequences. The badge he had used as a weapon would no longer protect him. His actions would not be swept under the rug. The system that had shielded him for so long was finally holding him accountable. As the room began to empty, Tiana turned to her father, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "We did it," she said, the words barely above a whisper. Malcolm placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening. "No," he said, his voice steady. "You did it. You showed them who you are. And no one can take that away from you." Tiana smiled through her tears, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had faced her fear, had stood up for herself and for others, and she had won. It wasn't just justice, it was a victory, one that would resonate far beyond the walls of that hearing room. The courtroom had emptied out, leaving behind an eerie stillness that seemed to echo with the gravity of what had just occurred. Tiana and Malcolm sat quietly at the table, absorbing the weight of the judge's decision. The once overconfident Ethan Grayson had been let out through a side door, his expression a mix of shock and anger. He had avoided looking at either of them, but it didn't matter. His reckoning had arrived, and for the first time, he had no control over what came next. Malcolm sat back in his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of a document on the table. His sharp, observant eyes now looked tired, though the fire behind them hadn't dimmed. He glanced at Tiana, who was staring ahead, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked older somehow, as if the experience had taken a piece of her innocence, replacing it with something heavier. On the ride home, the silence between them was profound, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. Tiana clutched her phone in her lap, her mind racing with everything that had unfolded. The testimonies, the overwhelming evidence, and finally the verdict. Justice had been served, but it didn't feel as triumphant as she had imagined. Her voice was hesitant when she finally spoke, breaking the silence. "Dad," she said softly, "do you think he'll ever really understand what he did? Or is he just angry because he got caught?" Malcolm's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles white against the leather. He exhaled slowly, as if trying to gather his thoughts. His response was measured, deliberate. "Some people never understand," he said, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. "They don't want to. For them, it's not about right or wrong. It's about control, about power. Losing that power is the only thing they understand." Tiana looked out the window, watching the city lights blur into streaks of gold against the darkening sky. "It's not enough," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it would feel different. Like everything would be okay once he was held accountable. But it's not. He hurt so many people, and nothing can change that." Malcolm glanced at her, his expression softening. "You're right," he said quietly. "It doesn't erase what he did. But it stops him from doing it again. And sometimes, that has to be enough." The next few days passed in a haze of media coverage and community reactions. The case had drawn significant attention, becoming a flashpoint for larger conversations about police accountability and systemic abuse. News outlets replayed snippets of the video Tiana had recorded, her voice shaking but defiant as she stood up to the man who had tried to silence her. Activists praised her bravery, calling her a symbol of resilience. Strangers left messages of support on social media, their words of encouragement a balm against the lingering pain. But with the praise came the inevitable backlash. Anonymous comments filled with vitriol and denial began to surface, their venomous words a stark reminder of the divide that still existed. Tiana read some of them at first, but Malcolm quickly noticed and intervened. "Don't give them your energy," he said firmly, taking her phone and setting it aside. "Their words don't define you. They don't deserve to take up space in your mind." Tiana nodded, but the hurt lingered. She couldn't understand how people could defend someone like Ethan, how they could dismiss the pain he had caused as if it were nothing. The thought weighed on her, pulling at the edges of her thoughts like a persistent thread. One afternoon, Malcolm received a call that shifted the course of their focus. It was from a federal prosecutor, someone he had worked with in the past. The voice on the other end was calm but urgent, explaining that the investigation into Ethan had uncovered something far larger than they had anticipated. The complaints against him were only the surface of a much deeper problem, a network of officers within his department who had engaged in similar patterns of abuse, shielding one another from consequences through a web of lies and cover-ups. Malcolm listened intently, his jaw tightening as the details unfolded. When the call ended, he sat in silence for a moment, his mind racing. He had suspected that Ethan wasn't an anomaly, that his behavior was part of a larger culture within the department. But hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. Tiana approached him, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Dad," she asked cautiously, "what's wrong?" Malcolm met her gaze, his expression grave. "This isn't over," he said simply. "Ethan wasn't working alone. There are others. And now we have a chance to expose all of them." The weight of his words settled between them, the enormity of what lay ahead dawning on both of them. Tiana felt a mix of emotions, relief that justice might extend beyond Ethan, but also exhaustion at the thought of continuing the fight. She had thought they were nearing the end, but now it seemed they were only at the beginning of a much larger battle. Malcolm spent the next several days coordinating with the prosecutor and other federal officials. The investigation widened, uncovering a trail of corruption that implicated several high-ranking members of the police department. Each revelation felt like a victory, but it also underscored the depth of the problem. For every name that was brought to light, there were countless others who had been silenced, their stories buried beneath a system designed to protect itself. Tiana watched her father work tirelessly, his determination unwavering. She admired his resolve, but she also worried about the toll it was taking on him. One evening, as he sat at his desk reviewing documents, she approached him, her voice hesitant. "Do you ever get tired of fighting?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. Malcolm looked up, his expression softening. He leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the edge of the desk. "Every day," he admitted. "But I keep going because I know what's at stake. Because if I don't fight, who will? And because I want you to grow up in a world where people like Ethan don't get to decide who matters and who doesn't." Tiana nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. "I want that too," she said quietly. "But sometimes it feels so big. Like no matter what we do, it'll never be enough." Malcolm reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It won't always feel that way," he said gently. "Change takes time. And it takes people who are willing to stand up, even when it's hard. You did that, Tiana. You stood up when it mattered most. And that's how we start to make things better." The words lingered in the air, a reminder of the strength they both carried. Tiana felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to see this fight through to the end. As they prepared for the next steps, the weight of the battle ahead loomed large. But for the first time, it felt like they weren't fighting alone. The cracks in the system were growing, and through those cracks, the light of accountability was beginning to shine. The days following the expanded investigation were a blur of activity, tension, and moments of quiet reflection. Malcolm rarely left his desk, poring over documents and coordinating calls with federal officials and prosecutors. His determination was steadfast, but Tiana could see the toll it was taking on him. His shoulders were heavier, his movements slower, but his resolve never wavered. Every time she glanced at him, she felt a mix of pride and guilt. She knew he was doing this for her, for the justice she deserved, but part of her wished he didn't have to bear so much of the burden alone. One evening, as Malcolm was preparing to leave for a meeting with the investigative team, Tiana wheeled herself into the living room where he was gathering his notes. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should speak, but the weight of everything they had been through pushed her forward. "Dad," she said softly, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to her, his expression softening as he saw the look in her eyes. "Do you ever wish it could all just go back to normal?" Malcolm set his notes down and crossed the room, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. "Tiana," he began, his voice calm but filled with emotion, "normal wasn't good enough. Normal is what let people like Ethan Grayson get away with what they've done for years. Normal is what silences people, makes them feel like they have no choice but to accept what's wrong. We can't go back to that." She looked away, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I know," she said quietly. "But sometimes it feels like it's too much. Like no matter what we do, it won't ever be enough." Malcolm reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's never too much when it's the right thing to do," he said firmly. "I know it's exhausting, and I know it feels like we're fighting a battle we can't win, but every step we take matters. Every voice we raise makes it harder for them to ignore the truth. And you, Tiana, you've been braver than anyone I've ever met. You've faced things no one your age should have to face, and you've done it with strength I could only hope to have." Tiana's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back, unwilling to let them fall. She met her father's gaze, her voice steadier now. Do you think they'll actually change anything? The system, I mean. Do you think it's even possible? Malcolm sighed, his brow furrowing as he considered her question. Change is slow, he admitted, and it's messy. But I've seen it happen. I've seen laws change, seen people stand up and demand better, and I've seen the power that comes when people refuse to stay silent. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's possible. And as long as we keep fighting, as long as we don't give up, we can make it happen. His words settled over her like a blanket, heavy but comforting. Tiana nodded, her resolve strengthening. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she couldn't let the weight of it all crush her. She had to keep going, for herself and for the countless others who couldn't. Malcolm left for his meeting, and Tiana stayed behind, scrolling through messages of support on her phone. Among the kind words and encouragement, there were also harsh comments, people who refused to see the truth or who blamed her for stirring the pot. She felt a pang of hurt with each one, but she reminded herself of her father's words. These voices didn't define her. They didn't deserve her energy. Later that night, Malcolm returned, his face a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. Tiana met him in the kitchen, her curiosity piqued by the slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. What happened? She asked, her voice tinged with hope. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms as he looked at her. We've got enough to move forward, he said. The evidence against Ethan's department is overwhelming. The corruption runs deep, but we've traced it back to key players. It's not just him anymore, it's the people who enabled him, who covered for him, who created a culture where abuse was tolerated. Tiana felt a swell of pride, but it was tempered by the gravity of what he had just said. So what happens now? Malcolm exhaled, running a hand over his face. Now it's in the prosecutor's hands. They're building a case, preparing to bring charges against everyone involved. It's going to be a long process, but it's a start. The weight of his words hung in the air, a mix of hope and the sobering reality of the road ahead. Tiana nodded, her mind racing with thoughts of what this could mean. She thought of the people who had testified, the voices that had finally been heard, and the countless others who had suffered in silence. This was for them, too. As the weeks went on, the investigation gained national attention. News outlets covered the unfolding scandal, exposing the depth of the corruption within Ethan's department. Public pressure mounted, and protests erupted across the city, demanding accountability and systemic change. Tiana watched the coverage with a mix of awe and disbelief. She had never imagined that her story could spark something so big, that her voice could be part of something that mattered. One evening, Malcolm sat down with her in the living room, his expression serious but warm. You've done something incredible, Tiana, he said. You've shown people that their voices matter, that they don't have to accept injustice. And because of you, because of your bravery, people are finally paying attention. Tiana looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. I couldn't have done it without you, she said quietly. You believed in me, even when I wasn't sure I believed in myself. Malcolm smiled, his pride evident. That's what family does, he said. We lift each other up, no matter what. Their words hung in the air, a reminder of the bond they shared and the strength they drew from each other. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like they were on the right side of history, pushing forward toward a better future. And as they prepared for the next steps, Tiana couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The following weeks were a whirlwind of developments that seemed to shift the ground beneath Tiana and Malcolm's feet every day. The federal investigation had escalated quickly, and with it came new revelations about just how deep the corruption in Ethan's department went. The faces of officers and officials were plastered across news channels, each one tied to the system that had shielded Ethan for so long. It was staggering to think that so many people had been complicit in enabling the abuse, each decision and cover-up contributing to a culture of silence and fear. Tiana often sat in the living room, watching the news with a mix of pride and sadness. It was overwhelming to see the impact her story had sparked, but it also reminded her of the countless lives that had been affected by the very system her father had dedicated his life to working within. She thought of the faces of the people who had testified at the hearing, their voices filled with years of pain and frustration, finally given a chance to be heard. One evening, as the soft glow of the television illuminated the room, Malcolm walked in, his expression heavy with the weight of another long day. He carried a stack of papers under his arm and placed them on the dining table before sitting down with a tired sigh. Tiana turned toward him, concern flickering in her eyes. "You've been working non-stop," she said, wheeling closer to him. "You need to take a break, Dad." Malcolm looked up at her, offering a faint smile. "There's no time for breaks, sweetheart. We're in the middle of something that could change everything. I can rest later." Tiana frowned, her gaze searching his face. "What if later never comes?" she said quietly. "What if you burn yourself out before you get there? You always tell me to take care of myself, but you're not doing the same." Malcolm exhaled, leaning back in his chair as he considered her words. She was right, and he knew it. The last few months had been relentless, and the toll it was taking on him was becoming harder to ignore. But every time he thought about stepping back, even for a moment, he remembered why he was doing this. It wasn't just for Tiana, it was for everyone who had been failed by a broken system. "I hear you," he said finally, his voice soft. "But I can't stop now. Not when we're so close to exposing the truth. If we don't push through, this could all fall apart. And I can't let that happen." Tiana looked down, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair. "I just don't want to lose you to this fight," she said, her voice trembling. "You've given so much already. I don't want you to give everything." Malcolm reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You won't lose me," he said firmly. "I promise. But I need you to trust me. This is bigger than us, Tiana. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what you did. It's about holding people accountable for the pain they've caused. And that's worth fighting for." Tiana nodded, though her worry lingered. She knew her father's heart, knew that he would give everything he had to see this through. It was one of the things she admired most about him, but it was also what scared her the most. She didn't want him to sacrifice himself for a system that seemed so resistant to change. As the investigation continued, more people came forward with their stories, emboldened by the attention the case was receiving. Malcolm worked tirelessly to connect them with the federal team, ensuring that every voice was documented and added to the growing body of evidence. The sheer volume of testimonies was overwhelming, each one a painful reminder of the harm that had been done. But it also strengthened their resolve, a testament to the power of collective action. One afternoon, Malcolm and Tiana met with a group of community leaders who had been organizing protests and advocating for systemic reform. The meeting was held in a small community center, the room filled with people from all walks of life, united by a shared purpose. Tiana felt a mix of nerves and excitement as she wheeled into the room, her presence drawing murmurs of recognition from the crowd. Malcolm placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his pride evident. The discussion was intense, filled with passionate voices and a sense of urgency. People shared their frustrations, their hopes, and their ideas for what needed to change. Tiana listened intently, taking in the stories and suggestions, her mind racing with thoughts of how she could contribute. When the room quieted, one of the leaders turned to her, his gaze kind but serious. "Tiana," he said, his voice steady, "you've shown incredible courage. Your story has inspired so many people to speak out, to believe that change is possible. What do you think we should do next? How do we keep this momentum going?" Tiana hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on her. She glanced at her father, who gave her an encouraging nod, and then took a deep breath. "I think we need to keep telling the truth," she said, her voice strong despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "We need to make sure people know what's happening, that they see the faces of the people who've been hurt, and the people who've done the hurting. It's easy for people to ignore numbers and statistics, but it's harder to ignore stories. We have to make this personal, because it is personal. Her words hung in the air, the room quiet as people absorbed what she had said. Malcolm looked at her with a mixture of pride and awe, his heart swelling at the strength she was showing. The leader who had addressed her nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said. "Stories are what move people. And yours is one that's already made a difference. We need to keep pushing, keep demanding accountability, and make sure the changes we're fighting for actually happen." The conversation continued, the room buzzing with ideas and plans for the future. By the time they left, Tiana felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to see this fight through. As they drove home, she turned to her father, her voice quiet but resolute. "I want to do more," she said. "I want to be part of this. I don't just want to watch from the sidelines." Malcolm glanced at her, his expression serious. "You're already doing so much, Tiana," he said. "Just by sharing your story, you've changed the conversation." She shook her head. "It's not enough. I want to help people, like you do. I want to make sure this doesn't stop with us." Malcolm's heart swelled with pride, but he also felt a pang of worry. He knew how hard this fight was, how much it could take out of a person. But as he looked at his daughter, he saw a strength that couldn't be ignored. She was ready, and he knew better than to stand in her way. "Then we'll do it together," he said finally, his voice filled with emotion. "Whatever it takes, we'll keep fighting. And we'll make sure that what we're building lasts." Tiana nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they weren't walking it alone. They had each other, and they had a growing community of people who believed in the same vision, a world where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. And together, they would do everything in their power to make it happen. The final chapter of the saga unfolded months later, with a culmination that neither Tiana nor Malcolm could have fully anticipated. The federal investigation had not only brought down Ethan Grayson but had exposed a systemic web of corruption and abuse that stretched far beyond a single precinct. The trials were extensive, with officers and officials testifying against each other in an effort to save themselves. One by one, the dominoes fell, and the once impenetrable shield of silence crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence. Tiana sat in the courtroom with her father on the final day of the sentencing hearings. The judge's voice echoed through the room as she read the sentences for Ethan and several other high-ranking officials. Ethan's punishment was severe, years behind bars, stripped of his badge and pension, his name forever tied to the systemic rot he had so proudly upheld. His face was a mask of defeat as he was led away in handcuffs, his arrogance and defiance replaced by a hollow silence. Tiana felt no pity for him, but neither did she feel triumphant. Instead, she felt a sense of closure, a weight lifting as justice finally prevailed. Malcolm, sitting beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression a mixture of pride and relief. "It's over," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You did it, Tiana. You stood up, and because of you, the truth came out." Tiana turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We did it," she said. "I couldn't have done this without you." In the weeks that followed, the aftermath of the trials brought sweeping changes. The police department underwent a complete overhaul, with new leadership and stricter accountability measures implemented. Community oversight boards were established, giving citizens a voice in the policies and practices of law enforcement. The changes were far from perfect, but they were a step forward, a sign that progress was possible. For Tiana, the journey didn't end with the trials. She began speaking at schools and community events, sharing her story and encouraging others to stand up against injustice. Her voice, once silenced by fear, had become a beacon of hope for others. She started a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of police misconduct, providing resources and legal aid to those who needed it most. The foundation quickly gained traction, drawing support from across the country. Tiana found purpose in the work, knowing that her efforts were helping to build a better future. Malcolm, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. He remained with the FBI but shifted his focus to internal investigations, using his expertise to root out corruption from within. His work brought him a sense of fulfillment, knowing that he was making a difference in a system that had once seemed unchangeable. Despite the long hours and challenges, he always made time for Tiana, their bond stronger than ever. One evening, as they sat together on the back porch of their home, Tiana looked out at the setting sun, her thoughts drifting. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if I hadn't recorded that video?" she asked, her voice quiet. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "I do," he admitted. "And it scares me." "But you did record it, Tiana. You made a choice to stand up for yourself, even when it was terrifying. That's what changed everything." Tiana nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. "I still think about the people who didn't get justice," she said. "The ones who didn't have someone to fight for them." Malcolm reached over, taking her hand in his. "That's why we keep fighting," he said. "For them. For the people who couldn't. And for the ones who still need us." Their words hung in the air, a quiet reminder of the responsibility they carried. But as they sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, there was also a sense of peace, a recognition of how far they had come and the difference they had made. To those of you who have followed this journey, what does justice mean to you? Is it accountability for those who have done wrong, or is it the hope that others won't have to suffer the same fate? Tiana's story is a testament to the power of courage, resilience, and the belief that even the smallest actions can create ripples of change. Her voice didn't just hold one man accountable, it sparked a movement, a call to action that reminds us all that silence is not an option in the face of injustice. What about you? How do you think we can continue this fight for justice and equality? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this conversation alive. Together, we can build a world where everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of resilience, courage, and unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and join us on this journey of storytelling with impact. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.